In the spring of 16 AD, Germanicus Julius Caesar, 31 years old, nephew of the Emperor Tiberius, and son of a general who died fighting in these same German forests, commanded 8 Roman legions and a fleet of 1,000 ships with a single purpose: hunt down the man who'd humiliated Rome 7 years earlier. By summer's end, according to both Roman and Germanic sources, the most devastating military reversal in tribal Germanic history would be documented across 10 miles of blood-soaked ground. Contemporary chronicles record the impossible mathematics: 60,000 Roman soldiers against a Germanic tribal coalition estimated between 50,000 and 80,000 warriors. But this wasn't about numbers. This was about vengeance for 20,000 Roman dead, 3 lost eagle standards that embodied Rome's sacred spirit, and 7 years of humiliation that had shaken the empire to its foundations. By the end of this video, you'll understand how documented historical sources reveal the greatest tactical victories in Roman military history, and why total battlefield dominance resulted in permanent strategic retreat. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that will change how you see the limits of military power forever. First, the naval strategy that transported an entire army through hostile territory without losing a single soldier to the ambush tactics that had destroyed 3 legions. Second, the family tragedy preserved in contemporary accounts, where 2 brothers screamed conflicting visions of civilization at each other across a river while their armies prepared for slaughter. And third, the 12 hours of systematic killing that proved Rome could win every battle and still lose the war. But here's what makes this historically fascinating. How did Germanicus transport 60,000 soldiers and their equipment through Germania without the traditional overland march that had proven suicidal? Why did Arminius, the Germanic war leader who'd orchestrated Rome's worst military disaster, accept battle on open terrain that favored Roman formations instead of the forests and bogs where tribal warriors excelled? How could contemporary sources on both sides document a single afternoon of combat that killed an estimated 20,000 to 40,000 warriors? What tactical decision in the battle's opening moments doomed an entire coalition? And why did Rome's most complete military victories result in the permanent abandonment of expansion east of the Rhine River? To understand how 60,000 men achieved tactical perfection while accomplishing strategic nothing, we need to step back to when Rome's world nearly ended in a German forest called Teutoburg. September of the year 9. 3 Roman legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, approximately 17,000 of Rome's finest soldiers, marched into the Teutoburg forest following their guide, a Romanized Germanic prince named Arminius. Historical sources document that none of them marched out. What happened over the next 3 to 5 days represents one of the most complete military disasters in Roman history. And understanding it is essential to grasping why the 16 AD campaign became Rome's obsession. Publius Quinctilius Varus commanded the doomed force. According to contemporary accounts, he trusted Arminius completely. The Germanic prince held Roman citizenship, had achieved equestrian rank, and commanded auxiliary forces in the Roman army. Arminius knew Roman marching orders with the intimacy of someone who'd led Roman troops. He understood the specific limitations of heavy infantry operating in restricted terrain. And in September of 9 AD, he used that knowledge to orchestrate annihilation. The ancient historian Cassius Dio describes the ambush in fragments that still convey the horror. Germanic warriors attacked the Roman column stretched out for miles along narrow forest paths. Legionaries trained to fight in open formations found themselves trapped between trees, unable to maneuver their large shields or form defensive lines. The attack lasted not hours, but days. A running massacre through bogs and forests where Roman discipline meant nothing and Germanic knowledge of terrain meant everything. Contemporary sources estimate between 15,000 and 20,000 Romans died. 3 entire legions simply ceased to exist as military units. But the physical casualties weren't what truly devastated Rome. The Germanic warriors captured the 3 legionary eagles, the aquilae, sacred standards that embodied each legion's spirit and Rome's divine favor. Ancient sources record that Emperor Augustus, upon hearing the news, beat his head against the palace walls shouting __0__. The psychological impact was profound. Rome's frontier, which Augustus had planned to extend to the Elbe River and establish Germania Magna as a province, collapsed back to the Rhine. Plans for Roman administration, taxation, and civilization east of the Rhine were abandoned. The forest had won. Arminius emerged from Teutoburg transformed. Born around 18 to 16 BC as a prince of the Cherusci tribe, he'd served Rome faithfully until the moment he chose not to. Contemporary Roman sources, written by his enemies, still acknowledge his military genius. After Teutoburg, tribal Germans who'd never united under a single leader rallied to the man Roman education had trained and Roman trust had empowered. He became, in the words the historian Tacitus would later use, the liberator of Germany. But Arminius's victory created complex political dynamics that would shape the 16 AD campaign. His own father-in-law, a Cherusci chief named Segestes, had warned the Romans about Arminius's planned betrayal. Varus had ignored the warning. Now, Segestes led a pro-Roman faction among the Cherusci, creating a civil war within Arminius's own tribe, even as he fought external enemies. This internal division would prove critical 7 years later. Augustus died in 14 AD, having never avenged Teutoburg. His adopted son Tiberius ascended to power facing immediate crisis. According to Tacitus's detailed account, massive mutinies erupted among the legions stationed in Pannonia and Germania. The soldiers, many having served for 30 or even 40 years without discharge or adequate pay, demanded reforms. Reduction from 20-year to 16-year service terms, increased compensation, and an end to brutal treatment by centurions. 4 legions at Castra Vetera and near modern Cologne threatened to march on Rome itself unless their demands were met. The mutineers even attempted to proclaim Germanicus, Tiberius' adopted son and nephew, as emperor. Contemporary accounts record that Germanicus vehemently rejected this treasonous offer, maintaining loyalty to Tiberius despite the soldiers' adoration. But the situation was precarious. Germanicus needed to redirect the legion's aggressive energy away from civil war and toward an external enemy. His solution, according to Tacitus, was immediate and brutal. Launch what sources describe as a quote one across the Rhine. The first target was the Marsi tribe, attacked during a religious festival at their sacred grove of Tanfana. Roman sources don't hide the savagery. The assault devastated a 50-mile radius. Tacitus records that Romans massacred the population regardless of age or sex. This wasn't a military operation. It was calculated terror designed to satisfy the mutinous soldiers' bloodlust while beginning a systematic campaign to destroy the coalition Arminius had built. During this raid, a Roman officer named Lucius Stertinius recovered the first of the 3 lost eagles, the standard of the 19th Legion, from the Bructeri tribe. The following year, 15 AD, Germanicus expanded operations with a 2-pronged offensive. While his legate Aulus Caecina Severus targeted the Marsi and Bructeri, Germanicus led forces against the Chatti tribe, destroying their capital at Matium. The campaign achieved a significant political victory when Germanicus rescued Segestes, Arminius's pro-Roman father-in-law, who was being besieged by his own people for collaboration. Segestes delivered to the Romans a prize that damaged Arminius politically. His own daughter Thusnelda, Arminius's wife, who was pregnant at the time. Contemporary sources preserve a moment from the 15 AD campaign that reveals Roman trauma still raw 6 years after Teutoburg. Tacitus describes how the army reached the site of Varus's disaster. Soldiers found whitening bones of men and horses scattered across the forest floor, skulls nailed to trees as offerings to Germanic gods. And the half-ruined fortifications where the final remnants of the Varian legions had made their last stand. According to Tacitus's account, the men looked on these remains as of their own blood and buried them with military honors, seeking closure for a wound that hadn't healed. But the 15 AD campaign also taught a terrifying lesson. Caecina's division, returning through the same region later that summer, nearly suffered Teutoburg's fate at a location called the Pontes Longi, long causeways through bog country. Germanic warriors ambushed the Roman column trapped in single file on the narrow paths. Only desperate fighting and some measure of luck prevented complete disaster. The message was clear. Traditional overland marching columns remained vulnerable to the same tactics that had destroyed Varus. Dense forests and vast bogs favored light Germanic infantry. Roman baggage trains became death traps. Even successful campaigns bled men and resources to constant harassment. As winter approached in 15 AD, Germanicus faced a strategic problem. Contemporary sources document that the Gallic provinces providing remounts and supplies were exhausted by 2 years of continuous demands. The Rhine frontier was secure, one eagle had been recovered, but Arminius remained undefeated and the coalition intact. Another campaign was necessary, but it couldn't follow the same pattern. The question wasn't whether to continue the war. It was how to fight a guerrilla enemy when that enemy controlled the terrain. Germanicus's answer would fundamentally change how Rome projected power into Germania. Inside his headquarters at Castra Vetera, during the winter of 15 to 16 AD, Germanicus studied maps that had killed better generals than him. Every overland route into Germania Magna led through forests, where Roman columns became coffins, and bogs, where discipline meant nothing. But the son of Drusus, who'd built canals and campaigned these same regions a generation earlier, recognized something previous commanders had missed. When you can't march through an enemy, you sail around him. The strategic problem was documented in blood. Caecina's near disaster at the Pontes Longi had demonstrated that even successful Roman columns remained vulnerable to ambush. Dense forests limited visibility and maneuverability. Swampy ground turned supply trains into anchors rather than assets. Germanic warriors exploited these advantages with tactical approaches Arminius had perfected: feigned retreats, ambushes from wooded heights, harassment of stretched-out marching columns. According to contemporary analysis, the fundamental issue was that traditional Roman logistics played to Germanic strengths. 60,000 men plus animals plus equipment created supply trains that moved slowly and presented targets for warriors who could attack and melt back into forests before heavy infantry could respond. Tacitus records that Germanicus recognized an alternative. The North Sea and Germania's river systems could become highways instead of barriers. This wasn't a new concept. His father Drusus had built a canal connecting the Rhine to the Ems for exactly this purpose nearly 3 decades earlier. But Germanicus planned something unprecedented in scale: transport an entire army, with all its equipment and supplies, deep into the Germanic interior via water, completely bypassing the border defenses and vulnerable forest marches. The construction project began immediately. Historical sources document that Germanicus ordered the building of 1,000 vessels. These weren't simple transport barges, but a sophisticated fleet designed for multiple operational requirements. According to Tacitus's description, the ships included broad-hulled transports built for stability in the North Sea's unpredictable waters, flat-bottomed boats that could navigate the shallow Germanic rivers and approach riverbanks for landing, and specialized craft with rudders at both ends, allowing rapid direction changes in narrow channels. The fleet assembled at what sources call the Batavian Island, near modern Nijmegen in the Netherlands. Contemporary accounts don't specify the exact timeline, but the logistical achievement was remarkable. Building 1,000 ships, training crews to operate them, and coordinating the movement of tens of thousands of soldiers required planning that likely consumed the entire winter. The strategic advantages this naval approach offered were multiple and documented. First, surprise. Germanic border defenses were positioned to intercept overland approaches. A fleet arriving via the Ems, or Weser rivers, could land Roman forces deep in the interior before tribal warriors could concentrate. Second, logistical efficiency. Heavy siege equipment like ballistae and onagri, weapons that would prove critical at the campaign's second major battle, could be transported alongside troops rather than dragged through mud by struggling pack animals. Provisions for an extended campaign traveled in ships' holds instead of vulnerable wagon trains. Third, and perhaps most important for battle readiness, soldiers and horses would arrive fresh rather than exhausted from weeks of marching through hostile territory. The force Germanicus assembled represented roughly 1/3 of the Roman Empire's total military power at that time. A concentration of strength that underscores how seriously Tiberius took the final pacification of Germania. 8 legions formed the core. Contemporary sources and later historical records identify them. Legio I Germanica, with deep roots in Caesar's original campaigns. Legio II Augusta, veterans of the Cantabrian Wars who would later participate in the conquest of Britain. Legio V Alaudi, quote 4, originally raised by Caesar from non-citizens in Transalpine Gaul, and known for having recovered their honor after losing their eagle to the Sicambri tribe in 17 BC. Legio XIII Gemina, the prestigious unit that had crossed the Rubicon with Caesar. Legio XIV Gemina, Legio XVI Gallica, Legio XX Valeria Victrix, famed for discipline, and Legio XXI Rapax, the _5_ legion formed during the civil wars. At full strength, each legion numbered approximately 5,000 to 6,000 men, though campaign losses from the previous 2 years likely meant some units were under strength. Historians estimate the total legionary force at between 40,000 and 48,000 heavy infantry. Supporting them were 26 auxiliary cohorts, approximately 13,000 auxiliary infantry recruited from Gallic and allied Germanic tribes, and 8 cavalry alae, totaling around 4,000 horsemen. Additionally, Germanicus brought cohorts of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite bodyguard, under his personal command. The total force, according to modern scholarly estimates based on standard Roman organizational structures, numbered between 60,000 and 80,000 men. This wasn't just the largest Roman army deployed in Germania since Varus's disaster. It was a combined arms force designed to exploit Roman advantages while minimizing vulnerabilities. The cavalry included elite Batavian units, famous for their ability to swim rivers in full armor. Specialist troops like Rhaetian and Gallic archers provided missile support. Artillery crews trained in operating siege engines accompanied the army. Everything that had made previous campaigns vulnerable, lack of supplies, exhausted troops, limited heavy equipment, was addressed through naval logistics. in April of 16 AD. Contemporary sources record that this massive fleet sailed through Drusus's Fosse, the canal Germanicus's father had built. The ships rode North Sea swells toward the Ems River mouth, carrying an army fresh, fully supplied, and prepared to fight on Roman terms. Germanic scouts undoubtedly reported this unprecedented movement, but the sheer scale and speed of the operation gave Arminius limited time to respond. The man who destroyed 3 legions through superior knowledge of terrain and ambush tactics now faced an enemy that had bypassed the terrain entirely. But Germanicus's campaign wasn't flawless. According to Tacitus's account, a logistical error at the Ems landing site created a delay that would prove significant. The troops disembarked on the left bank of the river when operational requirements demanded they be on the right bank for the march to the Weser. For several days, 60,000 soldiers and their equipment had to be ferried across, or bridges had to be constructed. This gave Arminius precious time to concentrate the tribal coalition's forces as the Roman army finally marched eastward toward the Weser River, approximately 50 to 60 miles from the Ems. They moved not as a vulnerable column stretched through hostile forests, but as an organized force in friendly territory, supplied by their fleet and ready for the kind of open battle where Roman discipline and equipment superiority could dominate. Across the Weser, Arminius gathered every tribe he'd united with Teutoburg's glory. The Cherusci, Bructeri, Marsi, Usipetes, and others answered his call. But before these armies clashed, contemporary sources preserve an encounter that reveals this war's true nature. A conflict not just about territory, but about civilization's gravitational pull and tribal identity's magnetic resistance. The Roman army reached the Weser River, called the Visurgis in Latin, in late spring of 16 AD. Across the water, visible on the opposite bank, Germanic warriors were assembling in numbers that must have stirred memories of Teutoburg. But before commanders could plan the river crossing and the battle beyond, something happened that military planning couldn't account for. According to Tacitus's detailed chronicle, Arminius requested an interview with his brother Flavus, who served as a decorated officer in the Roman army. The 2 men would meet at the river's edge, separated by water but divided by something deeper, and debate the soul of their people while both armies watched. To understand what happened at that river, we need to understand the 2 men who faced each other and what they represented. Germanicus, at 31, embodied everything Rome valued in military leadership. Contemporary sources, particularly soldiers' conversations Germanicus himself overheard, describe him with words like noble birth, patience, and affability. He was the son of Nero Claudius Drusus, who'd campaigned extensively in Germania from 12 to 9 BC before dying from a horse fall. Some Romans believed after receiving a supernatural warning to turn back. Germanicus had married Agrippina the Elder, granddaughter of Augustus himself, connecting him to the imperial bloodline. Their children accompanied the campaign, including a young boy who would later become the Emperor Caligula. But Germanicus wasn't just politically connected. Tacitus records an incident from the night before the battle at Idistaviso that reveals his leadership style. Wanting to know his soldiers' true morale, Germanicus wrapped himself in a wild beast's skin to avoid recognition and wandered through the camp listening to conversations. He heard men praising his noble birth and patience, which gave him confidence for the coming battle. The morning of the engagement, he reportedly experienced a dream where his sacrificial robe was splattered with blood. But then his grandmother Livia appeared and presented him with a pristine replacement. He interpreted this as divine favor. The blood of sacrifice would be traded for glorious victory. Across the river stood Arminius, now in his early 30s, 7 years removed from his triumph at Teutoburg. But those 7 years had brought complications. His wife Thusnelda, captured by the Romans in 15 AD, was pregnant when taken. Their son had been born in Roman captivity. His father-in-law Segestes had defected to Rome and was now being treated as an honored guest by the very empire Arminius fought. The coalition Arminius led remained formidable, but 3 years of Roman devastation, sacred groves destroyed, settlements burned, populations massacred, had tested tribal resolve. He held the coalition together through the prestige of Teutoburg. But that prestige required defending against this new Roman offensive. Contemporary sources document that Arminius's preferred tactics involved avoiding exactly the kind of open battle that was now approaching. He excelled at ambushes, feigned retreats, and exploitation of forests and bogs where Roman discipline provided no advantage. The fact that he was concentrating forces for a stand-up fight suggests either confidence or political necessity. Perhaps he couldn't retreat without losing the coalition's allegiance. But before strategy could be tested in combat, family drama would illustrate everything this war represented. Tacitus preserves the brothers' confrontation in remarkable detail. Arminius called across the Weser for his brother Flavus to meet him at the bank. Flavus was, according to the historical account, a decorated Roman officer who'd lost an eye in a previous campaign under Tiberius. For his loyal service, Rome had granted him increased pay, a neck chain called a torque, and a crown, the symbolic medals that represented Roman recognition of military valor. He crossed to his side of the river, and the brothers began shouting at each other, separated by the water's width but divided by worldviews. Arminius, according to Tacitus's account, opened by mocking what he called the, quote, Nine. He urged Flavus to return to their ancestral gods, to their mother, to the freedom of their fatherland. He characterized the Roman Empire as a predatory machine that took Germanic youths to fight its wars across the world. Rome, he argued, fleeced the tribes of their wealth through taxation and tribute, while offering only subjugation in return. The rewards Flavus had received, his pay increase, his neck chain, his crown, were pathetic compensations for selling his people's independence. Flavus's response, as recorded by Roman sources, defended what he called the greatness of Rome and the mercy of Caesar. He pointed out that Thusnelda and her child, though technically prisoners, were being treated as honored guests rather than enemies. He argued that Roman rule brought order, prosperity, and the inevitability of superior power. His own rewards, the pay, the torque, the crown, the recognition despite losing an eye in Rome's service, proved that the empire rewarded loyalty and valor, regardless of ethnic origin. Rome offered opportunity and civilization. Tribal life offered only endless feuding and poverty. The debate nearly descended into personal combat. Contemporary sources record that both men reached for weapons and had to be physically restrained by their respective comrades. Tacitus uses this scene to illustrate what he saw as the fundamental conflict, not just a territorial dispute, but an ideological struggle between the gravitational pull of Roman civilization and the magnetic resistance of tribal autonomy. In a single family, the question of Germania's future was embodied. Collaborate with Rome and gain material benefits, but lose independence, or fight Rome and preserve freedom, but accept perpetual war and poverty. Neither brother knew this would be their final conversation. The historical record is silent on Flavus's later fate. Arminius would survive the coming battle, but would be assassinated by his own relatives in 21 AD, just 5 years later, when he attempted to claim kingship over the Cherusci. The tribes he united to fight Rome would not tolerate one man claiming permanent authority. The very independence he fought for prevented him from consolidating power. The irony would have satisfied Roman propagandists. As the brothers parted, their armies prepared for a confrontation that would resolve their argument not through debate, but through the ancient arbiter of force. But first, Arminius had one more demonstration of the tactical brilliance that had destroyed 3 legions. He had identified a target, an elite Batavian cavalry commander whose courage exceeded his caution, and prepared a trap that would remind the Romans that even with naval surprise and overwhelming force, the liberator of Germany remained dangerous. Chariovalda commanded the Batavian auxiliary cavalry with a reputation earned through actions Roman chroniclers respected even in defeat. The Batavians, a Germanic tribe allied to Rome, had provided elite cavalry for decades. These warriors were famous throughout the empire for a capability that seemed almost supernatural. They could swim rivers in full armor, weapons and all, maintaining formation even in strong currents. According to military historians, this made them invaluable for reconnaissance, river crossings, and rapid strikes. Chariovalda had led these men in previous campaigns and understood both their capabilities and their pride. That pride, and perhaps overconfidence born from a string of successes, would cost him everything. Germanicus needed to cross the Weser before the main army could engage Arminius's forces. Contemporary sources document that he sent Chariovalda with the Batavian cavalry to seize a ford, a crossing point where the river was shallow enough for troops to wade across. The mission was standard cavalry doctrine. Cross rapidly, establish a bridgehead on the opposite bank. Allow the main army to follow. It was reconnaissance in force, the kind of operation elite cavalry performed routinely. According to Tacitus's account, Cherusci warriors appeared at the ford as the Batavians approached. An initial skirmish developed. Testing probes, the kind of preliminary combat that precedes larger engagements. Then the Cherusci did something the Batavians had seen Germanic warriors do before. They retreated. It appeared to be panic, a broken tribal force falling back before Rome's finest cavalry. Chariovalda, seeing opportunity, pursued. This was exactly what Arminius had planned. The feigned retreat is one of warfare's oldest tactics, but it requires discipline and terrain knowledge to execute properly. The Cherusci warriors drew the Batavian cavalry onto what Tacitus describes as a plain surrounded by wooded heights. Once Chariovalda's men were fully committed to the pursuit and isolated in the open ground, Germanic warriors who'd been hidden in the hills swarmed down from multiple directions, raining projectiles on the trapped cavalry. The tactical situation reversed in moments. Batavian horsemen who'd been pursuing a broken enemy suddenly found themselves surrounded on low ground, with Germanic warriors holding the heights. Contemporary military analysis suggests this is precisely the kind of terrain trap that made Arminius such a dangerous opponent. He understood that Roman and Roman allied forces excelled in open battle with room to maneuver, but became vulnerable when channeled into restricted spaces where numbers and position mattered more than training. Tacitus records that Chariovalda, recognizing the hopelessness of his situation, attempted to rally his remaining men for a breakout. The Batavian chieftain understood that sitting still meant slow destruction from missile fire. His only chance was to punch through the encirclement and reach the Roman main force, which contemporary sources indicate was close enough to hear the fighting. Chariovalda led the breakout attempt personally, attempting to smash through the Germanic lines with the shock power that made heavy cavalry effective. He died in the attempt. Tacitus doesn't provide details of exactly how Chariovalda fell, whether from Germanic spears, surrounded and overwhelmed by numbers, or struck down during the desperate charge. What the sources do record is that the arrival of the main Roman cavalry and legionary support eventually rescued the surviving Batavians. But the elite unit had been mauled, and more significantly, they'd lost their experienced commander days before the major battle. The tactical lessons were immediately apparent to Germanicus. Even with surprise achieved through naval logistics, even with numerical superiority and superior equipment, Arminius could still win engagements through terrain exploitation and tactical cunning. The Germanic war leader understood his enemy's weaknesses and had the discipline to execute complex maneuvers like feigned retreats that required warriors to run from the enemy convincingly before turning to attack. Historical analysis suggests this incident influenced Germanicus's deployment at the subsequent Battle of Idistaviso. He would be more cautious about sending isolated detachments into terrain that could become traps. More importantly, he would ensure that when the main battle occurred, it happened on ground where Roman formations could deploy properly, and Germanic advantages in terrain exploitation were minimized. The question was whether Arminius would accept battle on such ground, or whether he'd retreat deeper into Germania's forests and bogs where Rome couldn't follow. As Chariovalda's body was buried with Roman military honors, both armies moved toward positions along the Weser. Scouts from both sides probed and observed. The plain called Idistaviso, a name preserved in historical sources but whose exact modern location remains debated by scholars, would become the testing ground. According to contemporary accounts, the terrain there offered something neither commander could find elsewhere. Open ground suitable for Roman formations, but with hills nearby, where Germanic forces could position for their preferred downhill charges. It was terrain that gave both armies hope of victory. One of them would be catastrophically wrong. The plain of Idistaviso stretched between loops of the Weser River and a line of hills that rose to the east. Open ground where Roman discipline could function, where the triplex aces formation could deploy its full strength, where 60,000 men could answer 7 years of humiliation with the systematic violence Rome had perfected over centuries. According to Tacitus's description, this was terrain fundamentally different from the tangled forests of Teutoburg. Here, Germanic numerical superiority and tribal enthusiasm would face Roman formation fighting and equipment advantage. Germanicus had found his killing field. Contemporary sources don't specify the exact date, noting only that the battle occurred in late spring or early summer of 16 AD. What Tacitus does record in detail is the deployment of both armies. Arminius positioned his forces in an arc, clearly attempting to envelop the Roman army. The Cherusci, his own tribe, and the coalition's elite warriors held the hills. Their role, according to modern military analysis of Tacitus's account, was to act as a plunging force, charging downhill to build momentum and smash through the Roman center. The other tribes, Bructeri, Marsi, Usipetes, and others whose names would later appear on Rome's victory trophy, deployed in the plain and along forest edges, positioned to support the Cherusci assault and exploit any breakthrough. Roman sources document that the Germanic warriors carried their traditional equipment. Large shields made of wickerwork or wood provided protection, though, as Tacitus specifically notes, these shields would prove cumbersome in the dense fighting that would develop. The primary weapon was the frama, a spear with an iron point and wooden shaft that could be thrown or used for thrusting. Some warriors carried short swords, axes, or clubs. But the detail Tacitus emphasizes, and the one that would prove most significant in the coming slaughter, was what the Germanic warriors lacked. Most had no breastplates or armor protecting their torsos. Few wore helmets. They would fight with courage in numbers, but their bodies were exposed to Roman steel. Germanicus deployed his forces in the triplex aces, the three-line formation that had conquered the Mediterranean world. Tacitus specifies the arrangement in detail, allowing modern historians to reconstruct Roman tactical thinking. The first line consisted of auxiliary cohorts, Gauls and allied Germans, supported by foot archers from Rhaetian and Gallic tribes. Their role was to absorb the initial Germanic charge, to skirmish with missiles, to disrupt the tribal warriors' momentum before they reached the main Roman force. The second line represented Rome's ultimate military power. 4 legions, the 1st, 5th, 20th, and 21st, according to Tacitus's explicit listing, stood in formation alongside cohorts of the Praetorian Guard. This placement of the imperial bodyguard in the main battle line, rather than in reserve protecting the commander, demonstrated Germanicus's commitment. More significantly for command and control, Germanicus personally positioned himself in this second line, giving him a central view of the battlefield and allowing soldiers to see their commander sharing their danger. The third line contained the remaining 4 legions, the 2nd, 13th, 14th, and 16th, which scholars infer from the total force composition, along with light-armed allied contingents. These reserves could reinforce any breakthrough, prevent encirclement, or exploit opportunities that developed during the battle. On both flanks, strong cavalry wings prepared for a role that would prove decisive. The night before battle, Germanicus performed the reconnaissance that Tacitus records in specific detail. Wrapping himself in the skin of a wild beast to avoid recognition, the Roman commander wandered through his camp after dark, standing near tents to overhear what soldiers truly thought. He heard men praising his noble birth and patience, which gave him confidence that morale was strong. The following morning brought the dream of the bloody sacrificial robe and the pristine replacement from his grandmother Livia, which he interpreted as divine promise of victory. Contemporary sources suggest the battle began in the morning, though exact times aren't documented. What Tacitus does record is that the Cherusci initiated combat by charging from the hills. Thousands of tribal warriors rushed downward, using gravity to add momentum to their assault, screaming war cries that must have echoed across the plain. It was the kind of charge that had broken other armies, the raw power of warriors fighting for their homeland, convinced of their cause's righteousness. But Germanicus, according to Tacitus's account, spotted the charges beginning and made a decision that determined the battle's outcome. Rather than waiting for the Germanic assault to strike his lines, he immediately ordered his cavalry to execute a pincer maneuver. 1 cavalry division, which Germanicus personally led, another instance of the high-risk command style that made him beloved by soldiers, charged into the Germanic flank. Simultaneously, a 2nd division under the cavalry commander Stertinius circled to attack the Cherusci from behind. The timing was crucial. By launching the cavalry strikes before the downhill charge reached full impact on his infantry lines, Germanicus disrupted the attack's momentum. Germanic warriors who'd been focused on the Roman center suddenly had cavalry hitting them from the side and rear. The coordinated assault that Arminius had planned fractured. Tribal warriors found themselves trapped between charging Roman cavalry behind them and the advancing legionary wall ahead. As the cavalry engaged, the Roman infantry began its methodical advance. The auxiliary first line threw missiles, arrows, and javelins to further disrupt Germanic formations. Then came the order Tacitus specifically documents: aim for the faces. Because so many Germanic warriors lacked helmets, their faces represented unprotected targets. Contemporary sources record that Roman officers, exploiting this vulnerability, instructed soldiers to target the one area where even unarmored men were exposed. When the lines met in close combat, the technological and tactical disparities became brutally apparent. Roman soldiers advanced in tight formation, their large scutum shields overlapping to create a wall. They threw their pila first, the javelins designed to punch through shields and bend on impact, making the shields difficult to use. Then, as Tacitus describes, they closed with the gladius, the short sword that was, in his words. Quote 11. The fighting technique Rome had perfected over centuries involved systematic, disciplined thrusting from within the protection of the shield wall. Legionaries supported each other, stepped forward in coordinated movements, and struck with precision rather than wild swinging. Their lorica segmentata, the overlapping iron plate armor, protected their torsos. Their helmets protected their heads and necks. They fought as an organized machine. The Germanic warriors faced them with individual courage, but collective disadvantage. Tacitus explicitly states they lacked breastplates. Their large wooden shields, effective in some contexts, became what he describes as quote, _12 where portions of the fighting occurred. Their long frame of spears, good for throwing and initial thrusting, became unwieldy in the tight press of bodies. Most significantly, tribal warriors fought as individuals or small groups rather than in the coordinated formations Roman training made instinctive. The result, according to contemporary accounts, was a one-sided slaughter once the initial Germanic charge was disrupted. Warriors trapped between the cavalry pincer and the advancing infantry wall had nowhere to go. The Cherusci assault, meant to break the Roman center, instead broke itself against discipline and superior equipment. Within hours of first contact, sources document, the tribal lines collapsed. Warriors who moments before had been attacking now sought only escape. But Germanicus had chosen his ground well. The geography that follows, the three routes of death, would transform tactical victory into historical massacre. What Tacitus chronicles next defines the word annihilation in ways that still disturb readers 2,000 years later. According to his account, the killing lasted nearly 12 hours. From the moment the Germanic lines broke until sunset finally ended the pursuit. The ground for 10 miles, he specifically documents, was covered in Germanic bodies and discarded weapons. Modern historians analyzing these descriptions estimate that casualties may have reached between 20,000 and 40,000 warriors. Though these figures represent educated guesses based on the scale Tacitus describes, rather than documented counts from ancient sources, the fleeing warriors had 3 primary escape routes, and contemporary accounts record that each became a death trap. The first option was the Weser River itself. Thousands attempted to swim across, desperate to put water between themselves and the pursuing Romans. Tacitus documents their fates with brutal clarity, cut down by Roman archers while in the water, or carried away by the current. The combination of exhaustion from battle, the weight of whatever equipment they still carried, and the river's strength proved lethal. Bodies floated downstream for miles. The riverbanks became slippery with blood. The second route led toward the forest edges that bordered portions of the battlefield. Warriors fled into the tree lines, seeking cover in terrain where Germanic fighters traditionally held advantages. But the pursuit was systematic, not frenzied. According to Tacitus's account, some desperate men climbed into treetops, attempting to hide. Roman soldiers, in a detail the ancient historian preserves, shot them down, quote, 13, or crushed them when they felled the trees beneath hidden warriors. Infantry units methodically cleared the forest edges, hunting down survivors with the efficiency of professional soldiers performing an unpleasant but necessary task. The third option was flight across open ground, and this proved no better. Roman cavalry pursued fleeing warriors across the plain for miles. The horses were relatively fresh, having arrived by sea rather than exhausted from weeks of overland marching, while the tribal warriors were spent from battle. Contemporary military analysis suggests the Romans likely organized the pursuit in waves, with different cavalry units rotating through to maintain pressure. Individual warriors, or small groups, separated from any organized resistance, were run down and killed with lances or swords. The disturbing detail Tacitus includes, that some of the killing became recreational, reveals something about how Romans viewed this campaign. This wasn't war in the sense of two legitimate forces contesting territory. From the Roman perspective, documented in their own sources, this was punishment for Teutoburg, vengeance for the 3 lost eagles, and the systematic destruction of peoples who dared to humiliate Rome. The 12 hours of pursuit represented not just tactical necessity, but calculated terror. Casualty figures from ancient battles are notoriously unreliable, and Tacitus provides no exact count. What he does offer are the descriptive details that allow modern historians to attempt estimates. The 10-mile field covered in bodies suggests massive casualties spread across a large area. The 12-hour duration indicates pursuit that continued until darkness made further killing impractical. The fact that the Roman army was capable of immediately fighting a second major battle at the Angravarian wall suggests their own casualties were manageable. Likely a few thousand at most, based on their ability to maintain operational effectiveness. The Germanic casualties, based on the scale of the slaughter Tacitus describes and reasonable assumptions about the initial force size, may have reached between 20,000 and 40,000 dead. But historians clearly mark these as speculative figures. No ancient source provides a count. What can be stated with certainty, based on contemporary accounts, is that the Battle of Idistaviso inflicted catastrophic losses on the tribal coalition. Later chroniclers, writing from the Germanic perspective of cultural memory, would call it among the most terrible catastrophes to befall the tribes in this era. Roman losses, while not specified by Tacitus, appear to have been relatively light. The ancient historian's pattern was to prominently report Roman disasters. He had no incentive to hide casualties when they occurred. His silence on significant Roman losses at Idistaviso, combined with the army's immediate combat readiness afterward, suggests the battle went largely as Germanicus planned. The technological advantages of armor and formation fighting, combined with the tactical advantage of the cavalry pincer, meant that once the Germanic lines broke, Roman soldiers could kill with relative safety. Specific documented horrors from Tacitus's account include warriors throwing away weapons to run faster, desperate men abandoning even the possibility of defense in hope of escape. Men trampled each other in panic at choke points where pursuit caught fleeing groups. Horses, both Roman and Germanic, screamed with injuries. The sources, written primarily by Romans, indicate that the Germanic casualties included warriors of all ages, suggesting that the final phase of pursuit made no distinction between professional fighters and younger or older men not in the rout. As sunset approached, the Roman army ceased pursuit not from mercy or exhaustion, but from practical necessity. Darkness in unfamiliar territory presented risks, and the army needed to consolidate and secure the battlefield. The plain of Idistaviso had been transformed. Where armies had deployed that morning, corpses now lay in layers. Discarded Germanic shields, spears, and personal items were scattered across miles of ground. The Weser ran red. Forest edges were littered with bodies. It was, by any measure, a complete Roman victory. But as the soldiers made camp that night, Germanicus made a decision that would provoke one of military history's most catastrophic mistakes. Rather than simply securing the battlefield and claiming victory, he ordered the construction of something designed to humiliate the survivors into a final, suicidal confrontation. According to Tacitus, Germanicus ordered his soldiers to pile captured Germanic weapons into a massive mound on the battlefield at Idistaviso. Shields, frame spears, swords, axes, thousands of weapons taken from the dead or abandoned by the fleeing were stacked into what Roman military tradition called a victory trophy. But this wasn't simply a memorial. Roman soldiers carved into the trophy the names of the defeated tribes: Cherusci, Bructeri, Marsi, Usipetes, and others whose full list the sources preserve. The army then formally saluted Emperor Tiberius as Imperator, the title signifying a victorious general, crediting the emperor for the triumph despite Germanicus having commanded in the field. This trophy served multiple purposes. It was a religious offering to the gods who'd granted victory. It was propaganda demonstrating Roman dominance. And critically, from a political perspective, it credited Tiberius rather than allowing all glory to flow to the immensely popular Germanicus. A detail that would matter when understanding why Tiberius later recalled his nephew despite the campaign's military success. But the trophy had one additional effect that Germanicus either calculated or welcomed. It enraged the surviving Germanic warriors past the point of tactical sense. Contemporary sources document that the Germanic reaction to this monument was fury. The inscription of tribal names represented permanent record of their defeat and humiliation. The display itself, erected on what they considered sacred ground soaked with their kinsmen's blood, was intolerable. According to Tacitus's account, the surviving coalition leadership made a decision that defied military logic. Rather than dispersing to avoid a second catastrophic battle, they would rally for a final stand at a defensive position called the Angravarian Wall. The Angravarian Wall was, according to Tacitus's description, a massive earthen rampart that served as a tribal boundary between the Angravarii and Cherusci peoples. The terrain there offered what Idistaviso had not: a narrow plain hemmed in by the Weser River on one side and dense swampy forests on the other. The restriction of this terrain represented the Germanic coalition's hope. Here, Roman cavalry would have limited room to maneuver. Germanic warriors behind fortifications would force a costly frontal assault. Perhaps the restrictive ground would negate some of the Roman advantages that had proved so devastating in the open plain. From a purely military standpoint, the decision to fight again was catastrophic. The coalition had just lost tens of thousands of warriors in a single afternoon. Morale was shattered. The Roman army remained intact and could be reinforced. But from the perspective of tribal honor and political necessity, retreat before the trophy may have been impossible for Arminius and his fellow leaders. If they withdrew without further resistance, the coalition would likely fracture completely. Tribe after tribe would make separate peace with Rome, accepting client status to avoid further devastation. The victory trophy forced a choice: final resistance or total capitulation. Germanicus approached the Angravarian Wall with an army that had just fought 12 hours of continuous combat, but remained combat effective. Another indication that Roman casualties at Idistaviso had been manageable. When his scouts reported the Germanic position behind the rampart, contemporary sources document that he recognized a pure infantry assault would be costly. The wall provided height advantage and cover. Germanic warriors, fighting from fortified positions, could inflict significant casualties on attackers climbing the slope. The tactical innovation Germanicus employed reveals both Roman military sophistication and the level of preparation the naval logistics had enabled. According to Tacitus's specific account, the Roman army deployed artillery, ballistae that launched large bolts like massive crossbows, and onagri that hurled stones. These siege engines, which would have been nearly impossible to transport during a traditional overland march, had traveled with the fleet and were now available for field use. Tacitus describes the effect with a phrase that captures the terror of ancient artillery. Quote 14. The siege engines systematically suppressed the Germanic defenders atop the rampart, killing or forcing them to take cover while Roman infantry advanced. Under this covering fire, legionaries formed the testudo, the tortoise formation where soldiers overlocked shields overhead and on sides to create armored protection against missiles. The testudo allowed approach to the wall with reduced casualties from whatever projectiles the suppressed defenders could throw. Once the legionaries reached the rampart's base, the assault became brutal close-quarters fighting. Roman soldiers, protected by armor and fighting with the gladius in confined space, stormed the fortification. Contemporary accounts don't specify the exact duration of this assault, but the outcome was never in doubt once Roman forces topped the wall. The second battle became, in Tacitus's characterization, another massacre. Though this one occurred in even more restricted space between the woods and river than the plain of Idistaviso had offered. Among those fighting desperately in this final engagement were Arminius and his uncle Inguiomerus. Both, according to Tacitus, were wounded in the combat. But both survived through a detail the ancient historian preserves. They smeared their faces with blood to avoid recognition while escaping through the chaos. This wasn't cowardice by the standards of tribal warfare. Dead leaders couldn't continue resistance, but it meant that the Germanic coalition lost this second battle even more completely than the first, with their leaders forced to flee in disguise. The casualties from the Angravarian wall assault aren't separately documented by Tacitus, but the battle's characterization as a massacre and its occurrence immediately after Idistaviso's catastrophe suggests the tribal coalition had effectively been destroyed as a military force. Two devastating defeats in rapid succession. Tens of thousands dead. Leaders wounded and in flight. The organized resistance that Arminius had built since Teutoburg was shattered. Germanicus had achieved what Augustus and Tiberius had demanded. He'd avenged Teutoburg with systematic destruction. He'd recovered 2 of the 3 lost eagles. He'd proven that Roman military power, properly deployed with superior logistics and tactics, could destroy any Germanic force that accepted open battle. His soldiers believed the war was won, and that triumph in Rome awaited them. They couldn't have known that weather was about to change the entire meaning of victory. The Roman fleet that had transported 60,000 soldiers into Germania's heart now prepared to carry them home as conquering heroes. According to contemporary accounts, Germanicus decided to return the bulk of his force to winter quarters via the sea route that had worked so well on the approach. The army had accomplished its objectives. 2 major victories, massive Germanic casualties, eagle standards recovered, coalition shattered. Summer was waning, and the campaign had been, by any measure of battlefield success, a triumph. Then the North Sea reminded Rome that some forces can't be defeated by discipline or equipment. Tacitus chronicles the disaster in detail that suggests it fundamentally affected Roman strategic thinking about Germania. The fleet of 1,000 ships, loaded with soldiers, equipment, captured plunder, and the pride of total victory, encountered what sources describe as a violent summer storm. The description, sudden change in wind and torrential rain, matches the kind of North Sea weather system that can develop rapidly and devastate shipping even in modern times. The scattered fleet tells us the storm's severity. Ships were driven onto the Frisian islands, which lie along the modern Dutch and German coast. Other vessels were blown hundreds of miles off course, some reaching the British coast. The loss of control was so complete that soldiers, according to Tacitus's account, were forced to make desperate choices. To prevent ships from foundering in the heavy seas, they threw overboard horses, pack animals, and heavy equipment. The specialized siege engines that had proven so valuable at the Angravarian wall went into the sea. Supply stockpiles accumulated during the campaign were lost. Months of plunder that would have helped pay for the expedition disappeared into the waves. The human cost isn't precisely documented by Tacitus. He doesn't provide a death toll for the storm, but the operational impact was severe. Ships scattered across the North Sea had to be located and gathered. Equipment would need to be replaced. The psychological impact on Germanicus himself was, according to contemporary sources, profound. Tacitus records that the commander was devastated by the disaster, feeling that his battlefield achievements had been undermined by forces beyond his control. But Germanicus understood that perception mattered as much as reality in this kind of warfare. If Germanic tribes learned that Roman forces had been significantly weakened by the storm, the deterrent effect of the Idistaviso and Angravarian wall victories would be lost. Resistance might reignite. Tribes that had been considering submission might choose continued defiance. The response had to be immediate and visible. According to Tacitus's account, as soon as the fleet's remnants returned and forces were reorganized, Germanicus launched fresh raids against the Chatti and Marsi tribes. The explicit purpose, as documented in contemporary sources, was to demonstrate that the Roman army remained, quote, 15 despite naval losses. The message had to be clear. Rome was returning to the attack with equal spirit, undiminished in capability or will. During one of these punitive raids, Roman forces achieved an objective that mattered more for propaganda than tactics. They recovered the second of the 3 Varian eagles from a Marsi sacred grove, where it had been buried as a religious offering. This standard, belonging to either the 17th or 18th Legion, joined the 19th Legion eagle recovered in 15 AD. 2 of the 3 sacred standards lost at Teutoburg were now back in Roman hands. The recovery of this second eagle provided Emperor Tiberius with the political justification he needed to declare the Germanic campaigns successfully concluded. 3 legions had been destroyed in 9 AD, their eagles captured and Rome humiliated. Now, 7 years later, 2 eagles had been recovered, massive victories documented, and Germanic power broken in the field. From a propaganda perspective, this was sufficient. The 3rd eagle wouldn't be recovered until 41 AD, 25 years later, when it was found among the Chauci tribe. But with 2 of 3 returned, Tiberius could claim honor had been satisfied. What happened next reveals the fundamental disconnect between tactical success and strategic value. Germanicus, according to historical sources, requested permission to conduct one more campaign season in 17 AD. The coalition was shattered, Arminius wounded and in flight, tribal resistance fragmented. One more year, Germanicus argued, could complete the conquest of Germania Magna, re-establish the Elbe as Rome's frontier, and finally transform the region into a Roman province, as Augustus had originally planned. Tiberius said no. Contemporary sources, particularly Tacitus, writing with little affection for Tiberius, portray this decision as motivated by jealousy of Germanicus's overwhelming popularity. The young commander's victories and personal charisma made him beloved by legions and Roman public alike, a potential political threat to an emperor who already viewed his adopted son with suspicion, But modern historians analyzing the strategic situation argue that Tiberius's calculation was more pragmatic than petty. The naval disaster had demonstrated the operational risks of campaigning in Germania even after battlefield victories. The economic cost of maintaining 8 legions, 1/3 of Rome's total military power, in sustained operations was enormous. More critically, a crisis was developing in the east. Armenia, a buffer state between Rome and Parthia, faced succession disputes that threatened to draw both empires into conflict. Resolving this required a high-level Roman presence with diplomatic skill and military prestige. Germanicus possessed both. The recall was presented as a reward rather than a punishment. The triumph, the formal victory celebration, would be granted. Honors would be voted. A second consulship would follow. But the Germanic campaigns were over. Whether Tiberius made this decision from jealousy, strategic wisdom, or both, the result was the same. Rome's greatest tactical victories in Germania would not result in territorial expansion. On May 26, 17 AD, Germanicus rode through Rome's streets in triumph while hundreds of thousands of citizens lined the route shouting his name. According to Tacitus's account of the ceremony, behind the victor's chariot walked Thusnelda, Arminius's wife, in chains, with their young son Thumelicus beside her. The crowds, still raw from Teutoburg's memory 7 years prior, screamed for the blood of the woman whose husband had killed their legions. Also present at this triumph, in a detail that captures the tragedy of collaboration, was Segestes, Thusnelda's father, who had betrayed his son-in-law to Rome. He watched his daughter and grandson paraded as trophies of a war that had divided his family and people. The Senate voted honors. A triumphal arch was dedicated in Rome to celebrate the recovery of the standards under Germanicus's leadership and Tiberius's command. The celebration marked what Rome presented as total victory. 2 eagles recovered, Arminius's coalition shattered, massive Germanic casualties documented by sources on both sides. But what the triumph didn't celebrate, because it couldn't acknowledge, was that this victory celebration also marked the permanent end of Roman territorial expansion in northern Europe. Germanicus never returned to Germania. In 17 AD, he received his second consulship and was sent to the east with Imperium Maius, supreme authority over the eastern provinces. The Armenian crisis that Tiberius had cited as requiring his presence was real. Germanicus successfully installed a Roman client king, demonstrating the diplomatic skill that matched his military capability. But on October 10, 19 AD, at Antioch in Syria, Germanicus died at age 33. Contemporary sources document that the cause was likely illness, but conspiracy theories blaming Tiberius emerged immediately and persisted for generations. The public mourning was intense. Riots erupted in Rome. The emperor, widely suspected of ordering his nephew's death, faced accusations he could never fully escape. Arminius survived the wounds he'd sustained at the Angravarian wall and continued fighting. But the coalition he'd built was fragmented. Without the unifying threat of a Roman presence, the tribes returned to their traditional feuds. According to Tacitus's later account, in 19 AD, Arminius attempted to claim kingship over the Cherusci. The tribes who'd followed him against Rome rejected the attempt. Germanic tradition favored collective governance by councils of elders and chiefs, not monarchy. Individual leaders could be elected for specific campaigns, but permanent kingship contradicted the very independence they'd fought to preserve. In 21 AD, just 5 years after surviving Rome's greatest victories, Arminius was assassinated by his own relatives. Tacitus, who had little reason to praise Germanic leaders, still acknowledged him in remarkable terms. The historian called Arminius the liberator of Germany, while noting he'd been, quote, 17. Even Tiberius, according to Tacitus, had considered Arminius more dangerous than external enemies. The man who destroyed 3 Roman legions and survived 2 catastrophic defeats was ultimately killed not by Rome, but by the political structures of the independence he'd fought to preserve. The long-term consequences of 16 AD became clear over the following decades and centuries. The Rhine-Danube line became Rome's permanent frontier in northern Europe. The Limes Germanicus, the fortified border with its watchtowers, forts, and roads, was constructed and maintained for approximately 400 years until the Western Roman Empire's collapse in the 5th century. This was an extraordinary duration for a military frontier, suggesting that Tiberius's strategic assessment about Germania's limits had been correct. The cultural division the Rhine frontier created shaped European history. West of the Rhine, in regions that would become modern France, Belgium, and Western Germany, Roman civilization took root. Latin evolved into Romance languages. Roman law, architecture, Christianity transmitted through Roman channels, and urban culture created a foundation that survived Rome's political collapse. East of the Rhine, Germania Magna developed independently. Germanic languages persisted. Tribal structures evolved without Roman provincial administration. When Germanic peoples later migrated into the Roman Empire during its decline, they came as distinct cultures rather than Romanized populations. Modern historians, analyzing why Tiberius chose withdrawal despite Germanicus's victories, point to several factors. Germania Magna lacked the economic resources that made other conquests profitable. The region had no wealthy cities to tax, limited agricultural surplus to exploit, and valuable resources like amber that could be obtained through trade rather than occupation. The military cost of permanently garrisoning the territory would require forces needed elsewhere. And perhaps most tellingly, where even after 2 catastrophic defeats, Germanic resistance hadn't collapsed completely. Arminius survived. Tribes could retreat into forests Rome couldn't fully control. Permanent occupation would mean permanent guerrilla warfare in terrain that favored defenders. The irony of Idistaviso and the Angravarian Wall is profound. By measures of tactical success, these battles rank among Rome's most complete victories. The casualty ratios, the speed of victory, the systematic destruction of enemy forces, all represent Roman military capability at its peak. Germanicus had proven that given proper logistics and favorable terrain, Roman legions could destroy any Germanic army. But this proof of tactical superiority led directly to strategic withdrawal, establishing a principle that would define European geography for centuries. Some territories aren't worth conquering even when you can win every battle. The Battle of Idistaviso can be visited today, though its exact location remains debated by scholars. The general region near modern Minden, Germany, in Lower Saxony, is accessible to those interested in military history. Unlike the Teutoburg forest battle site, which has been extensively excavated and has a major visitor center at Calcris, no definitive archaeological evidence has pinpointed Idistaviso's precise location. The Weser River still flows through the region. The terrain that once witnessed one of Rome's greatest victories and most significant strategic retreats is now peaceful German countryside. In the end, the Battle of Idistaviso stands as history's most complete demonstration that winning every fight doesn't win the war. Germanicus proved Rome could defeat any Germanic army in open battle with proper logistics and tactics. Tiberius proved that some territories exceed the cost of conquest regardless of battlefield victories. The Rhine frontier held for 4 centuries, not because Rome was weak, but because emperors learned the limits of even the world's greatest military power. Arminius lost an estimated 20,000 to 40,000 warriors based on the scale of slaughter contemporary sources describe, but won his people's freedom from Roman provincial administration. Germanicus won immortal glory documented in triumph and honor, but lost the war of territorial expansion. The forest that had broken Rome in 9 AD remained unconquered, a reminder that empires end not where they lose battles, but where they choose to stop winning them. The legacy of 16 AD wasn't the corpses covering 10 miles of German plain or the 12 hours of systematic killing. It was the recognition that military dominance has limits, that tactical perfection can't overcome strategic impossibility, and that sometimes the wisest victory is knowing when not to advance.